And good afternoon, everybody. I am Peter Lakota, your volunteer chairman, and on behalf of our board of directors, I want to welcome you to this first in a series of video conferences for Rail Passengers Association. You know, the coronavirus has changed our lives dramatically, and unfortunately, it led to the cancellation of our spring meeting in Washington and our day on the Hill. But change is not necessarily bad. Our small but nimble professional staff in DC is adapting to this change. And one of the ways that we're going to be reaching out to you this year is going to be with video hookups to keep you informed on passenger rail advocacy issues. And while we can't meet today in the same form as we have in the past, we can certainly embrace new technology, and we have the tools to make this work even better for us. The video that you'll see today can be styled for a national event or shaped for a regional conference or a special cause. And I know that our DC staff is working hard behind the scenes to make this happen in the future. But your input and your ideas will help shape how we move forward and with this new way of communicating with you. This is also a conduit for rail passengers to bring important information from key players to you. And today especially, we have a guest, Congressman Seth Moulton of Massachusetts, and as Sean just mentioned, his recently filed bill could be a game changer for high-speed rail between our major cities. And he's certainly no stranger to high-speed rail. I had a chance to meet with him when of all time and places. He was working for Texas Central here in Dallas in its early years, developing the plan for bullet trains between Dallas and Houston. So I hope you'll find today's video call helpful for you. If you pick one nugget of information out of today's call, then consider it a successful start. We all want to see more trains for more people to more places, and I want to thank you for your efforts in passenger rail advocacy. So now I'm going to turn things over to our Rail Passengers President and CEO, Jim Matthews, for this presentation. Thank you.
Terrific. Thank you, Peter. Appreciate it. And I see folks are still hitting the waiting room and joining the participants list. So welcome to all of you. As Peter said, we're going to try this out as a way to keep everyone informed and engaged and working on our issues. Because as anyone who's been paying attention to the news for the last 24 to, we'll call it 48 hours knows, the work is far from done. So we definitely have a lot to talk about today. As Sean mentioned, we had close to 500 folks register for this webinar today. So really the best way to do the questions, as Sean mentioned, is to use the chat room, the chat box, put your question there. Our moderators behind the scenes are gathering those together, and we will try to get to as many of those as we can. And also we will be making the slides available to everyone at the end of, once we're done with this. So again, thank you so much for being here. Next slide, please. So the big question, obviously, is when will travel get back to normal? And you look at where we were in February. Amtrak was in great shape in February. It was the best February they'd ever had. We were on track for ridership records again. And it was just looking terrific. And then, of course, the coronavirus outbreak began, and here we are. Amtrak ridership's now down 95%, 9-5, compared to the same period a year ago. So you're looking at, in the real trough of this outbreak, maybe 4,000 passengers total being carried system-wide, that's throughout the entire country, on all 305 trains that Amtrak operates. So that's a dramatic, I mean, there's no looking at that and concluding that things can just keep on going as normal. Even before the coronavirus, a lot of the transit agencies, commuter rails and so forth, they were having a hard time. And they're now in the same boat as Amtrak. They've lost 90% of the ridership. And a lot of those state support funds that go to take care of those transit agencies and commuter rail agencies, those are being spent on other things, or they're simply not available. Right now, when you talk to Amtrak, their management folks and forecasters, they're thinking that they're going to come in somewhere around 50% of ridership in fiscal 21. So that would be just over 16 million riders. And when you look at the fact that we were at 4,000 riders a month, or 4,000 riders a day not too long ago, even that might be a little ambitious. Next slide, please. So we're all wrestling with this. Here is, you may have seen news accounts about Amtrak doing a letter to Congress asking for supplemental request. So what that means is your association, we were able to help get Amtrak the first tranche of supplemental money, 1.3, in the CARES Act, and it's clear that they're going to need more. And so Amtrak CEO Bill Flynn sent a letter to the congressional leadership outlining the problem and what the detailed analysis of the problem is, and what they think they may need. And this image comes from that presentation. And you can see the orange line shows you where they would have been had we not had the COVID problem, and popping right up over 3 million or so riders a month, which would just be tremendous compared with where we were. And now the forecast, as you can see, is dramatically off. The gray line shows you the current fiscal 20 forecast leading into fiscal 21, and it's not good. And you can quibble about the degree to which we may see a comeback. I think I'm a little bit more optimistic than Amtrak, but not much more. This is going forward a pretty reasonable look at what we think the short-term problem is going to be. Now, we're not talking about fiscal 23, 24, or the out years. I think we will come back, but for the time being, this is the reality that Amtrak's operating with. Next slide, please. So Amtrak needs to cut operating costs $500 million in fiscal 21 to offset that reduced revenue. This is a shame on many, many levels, not the least of which is if any of you have been paying attention to our emails and hotlines and so forth in the past few months, you'll recognize that we were applauding the original fiscal 21 request for its vision and its boldness and its attempt to ask for more money to support the state-supported corridors so that it could do those state services and regional services without robbing Peter to pay Paul, without attacking the long-distance network to pay for that. It was a tremendous move by Amtrak, and we were really pleased that they went that way. So here we are now looking at fiscal 21, looking to cut operating costs $500 million. $150 million of that is going to come from reduced frequency and capacity. So the consists will be smaller. We'll have fewer coaches, fewer sleepers. And on the long distance network, they're talking about perhaps going as low as 3 times a week throughout the system. And the Northeast Corridor will be reduced frequencies as well. They're looking at $350 million in workforce reductions. That would be 20% of the Amtrak employees. They're trying very hard to go with voluntary separations, early retirements, buyouts, that kind of thing, rather than forced layoffs. But that is a possibility in the letter that Amtrak has outlined to Congress. Next slide, please. So at the same time, we did start to see, I hate to use the phrase, but some of those are what they call green shoots. On June 1st, they are adding additional capacity back in that they had taken out in the depths of the coronavirus crisis. There's additional coaches and additional sleepers being added back to some of the long distance routes because there was some indication based on forward bookings that people wanted that space and they were trying to make reservations for it. In fact, when I had a conversation last week with some of the top Amtrak management about this, we learned that had they not added those coaches, the space would have been sold out. And so they had to do that just to accommodate the demand they were seeing in the forward booking. Now, when we say sold out, remember in the post-COVID world, the reservation system is holding everything to 50% so that people can be physically distant from one another on the coach. So they're not selling all the seats, they're only selling 50% of the seats. And they were bumping up against that 50% level based on forward bookings. So they added coaches. So there's a little bit of encouragement there. There's still mass service disruptions in effect. You can go online and take a look at those services, but it's pretty much across the board. Next slide, please. A few other things that they're doing to respond to the COVID crisis. The flexible dining service, which is the prepackaged meals, they'll be doing that system-wide through at least June 30th. Originally, they had hoped to revisit that at the end of May and potentially bring some of that back. The end of May is approaching, and it looks like the demand is still not quite there. And there's also the issue of the safety of the crews. So you're going to need to keep up the prepackaged meal service for a little while longer. They will look again at the end of June on what they can do and whether that changes. There's a lot of folks out there that are saying that this is designed to be a permanent change. It's not. They are every 30 days looking at whether they can bring the traditional service back to the Western trains. They know it's a good service. They know they need to do it. But there are some safety reasons why it's really a problem for them right now. So the other thing that emerged in the past couple of days, Congress, again, working with us as the Rail Passengers Association, with a lot of advocates, including many of you who are on this call, we fought very, very hard to get the station agents restored when Amtrak cut them. And Congress actually wrote into the law a requirement that Amtrak fill these customers, these station agent positions at least these 15 locations where they had been cut. And so that is what's going to happen. They will be restored because the law says they will be restored. You'll see Maricopa, Roger, on the chart. That is on the list. And so there's a law that says those guys are going to be restored, so they're going to be restored. That doesn't necessarily address the remainder of the system, however. Next slide. I mentioned a little bit earlier about what you do to bring back Amtrak safely. They are holding reservations down to 50% of capacity. The sleepers obviously are a good choice for distancing, obviously. They are really stepping up the pace on cleaning and disinfecting, both on board and when the trains are in the yard. They are adding protective barriers. They're requiring everybody to have a facial covering on either in the station or on board. The cafe service is going to be carry out only, just like the restaurants in my own neighborhood are, for the exact same reason. We talked about the flexible dining. And right now, Amtrak is only taking cashless payments. And while I fully understand the safety implications of handing physical pieces of paper over to other folks, there's a significant population out there that relies on cash, that particularly traveling coach on some of the long distance routes. There are folks who are what the social scientists call unbanked, which means that they cannot afford a bank account or a credit card, and this is how they pay for things. So longer term, we're going to have to find an answer for those folks. Next slide. Actually, I'm sorry, Sean, go back one. So one thing I wanted to add is I'm also involved in a group of folks that is working on how to bring the entire surface transportation network back safely. The FRA administrator and I are working together to pull together a group of folks, which we plan to meet next week. It'll include FRA, Federal Transit Administration, Amtrak, APTA, the American Public Transit Association, commuter rail folks, and some medical and engineering experts from academia. So Auburn University, Texas A&M, a few others. And we're going to have a kind of summit meeting to talk about some of the steps that the medical and engineering community has already come up with to address the potential for bringing transportation back safely. I've been involved with that group since really mid-March, And so we're really pleased to be able to do this meeting next week to sort of talk about what we've come up with. Next slide, please. So to take what's going to be an hour-long meeting and summarize it onto one slide, this is what our group is working on. We are looking at not just surfaces, but cleaning the air. That is going to make a tremendous difference in the degree to which the infection is spread and transmitted. And we absolutely need to continue keeping surfaces clean, using hand sanitizers, using masks, all of those things. But at the same time, there is technology that can be applied, both ultraviolet light units and aerosolized hydrogen peroxide, which you can use to clean the air, along with increasing the rate at which you replace the air in a given space. And if you can replace the air more frequently and disinfect that air as it goes into the spaces, that will go a long way towards making all of the stations and waiting areas and rail coaches and all of those places safer to be in. So that's kind of a summary of what we'll be discussing next week in that interdisciplinary group that I'm working on with the FRA administrator. Next slide. But one of the things that we're all going to face, either in that group next week or all of us here in the association and all of you on the call today, there are so many unresolved questions. We don't know so much. We don't know if there's going to be a second coronavirus wave. There are a lot of medical experts, epidemiologists who are saying that, yes, we can expect a second wave, and it could be worse than the first one. What about the role of the state-supported corridors, the commuter railroads, when you look at state budgets collapsing in the face of the coronavirus crisis? And we've already seen on the federal side, but there are communities all across the country that are just shutting down their civic services because they simply can't afford to keep them up. And in that environment, that climate, where are the states and communities going to get the money to support their state-supported services or their commuter services? Another thing is the work from home trend. What are we doing right now in this meeting? I'm sitting here on a screen, you're sitting on a screen, and we're having what I hope is a very effective meeting. But one of the things that tells us is that there's a potential that we will see more of this take place even after the coronavirus has passed. At the same time, if you haven't read it, I put up a column a couple of weeks ago on our website, railpassengers.org, in the news and commentary blog, about this work from home trend. And I talked about the fact that there are plenty of business functions and job functions that you just can't do online. You just can't do them. And there are negotiations that need to take place. There's physical contact that needs to take place. And then on top of that, we also have the phenomenon of a lot of people who thought that working from home would be terrific. And then they were forced to it. And after 10 weeks or so of being forced to work from home, they're pining to go back and see regular humans again. I think that is an underappreciated element in the work from home trend. Will we see more teleworking? Absolutely, no question. On the other hand, I think that the idea that we will no longer work together I think that's foolish. Humans are fundamentally a social species, and too much business gets done face-to-face and in person. And then the last thing that's a big unknown, what happens to, we have some really exciting projects out there. Brightline, working those trains, they're terrific. It's great service. And then the Texas Central project. We've testified before the FRA recently to support Texas Central's rule of particular applicability. It's an exciting project. What is going to happen to those projects in this kind of an environment? Again, when I talk to people and when I visit with folks who are outside of the rail community, I see a lot of pent-up demand to go places, to get on the train, to travel, to be involved in society again. So I don't necessarily see that it's going to take 2 years for us to recover. But it might take 6 months, 6 to 7 months. That would be, I think, a reasonable look at it. But that's all of these unresolved questions. This is the framework in which our legislators are grappling with what to do next. And your association, we've been very much in touch with the folks on Capitol Hill and in the agencies. Everyone is working very, very hard on this. But I wanted to turn it over to Sean to give you more of an update on sort of the legislative landscape that we got. Sean.
Thank you, Jim. That was an excellent setup, and in fact, it kind of stole what the setup I was going to give myself. So I'm just I'm going to launch into it because there are a lot of variables. This is a little bit like trying to hit a bullet with a bullet, and we've had some successes, some failures, and I kind of want to go into it. Again, there will be an opportunity to ask questions. So if anything occurs to you, just type it in the chat screen. We'll try to get to it. If we don't get to it during the Q&A, try to get to it in the email we send out after, kind of summarizing this webinar. You know, Jim mentioned we got what we wanted in the CARES Act, which passed late March. It was really a testament to the kind of coalition we have built within Congress, both in the House and the Senate, and it's bipartisan. It produced an Amtrak supplemental grant of over $1 billion and mass transit grants of $25 billion. And it wasn't just the members of Congress. It really was our members responding to the call to action on short notice, I would add, because it developed very quickly, and we weren't sure when the bill was going to be introduced and when it was going to be passed. And the fact that you all came through is really a testament to your passion, your dedication to this mission. So we thank you for that. Unfortunately, in the most recent coronavirus response package that touches on transportation, we received a much less satisfactory response. The House Democrats passed the HEROES Act, which is a $3 trillion bill. It touches on many parts of the economy, many parts of the coronavirus response. I'm just really going to focus on the transportation part and save my judgment for that small section of it. Amtrak received $0. There were a couple directives for Amtrak dealing with protective equipment on board Amtrak trains for passengers and employees, for rules for disinfecting stations, work areas on board trains. They were good suggestions. They were also a little redundant because most of these things Amtrak was already doing. On the mass transit side, we saw $15.75 billion. Now that's a lot of money, especially coming on top of what was received in the CARES Act. But it is only around 60% of what mass transit agencies predict they're going to need to make it through calendar year 2021. And we also saw $15 billion given to highways in federal general fund subsidies and no flexibility in these funds, which we are very disappointed in. Highways have received $141 billion in general fund transfers since 2008, and we've been consistent in our position that if we're going to give general funds to highways, then states ought to have a choice in how they spend it, because it's not coming from the gas tax. So, you know, there's a couple ways to look at this. The first is this was a House Democrat-led initiative with not a lot of Republican support. And so we can be a little disappointed in the fact that in what is essentially a messaging bill, we didn't get anything for Amtrak. We got a lot less than what we needed for transit, and highways hit their mark, but in a $3 trillion bill, the Democrats in the House still kind of had their accounting visor on and were going over fine-tooth comb for passenger rail. I suppose the silver lining to that cloud is that according to Senator Mitch McConnell, who's majority leader over on the Senate side, he has no interest in taking up this bill. This was mostly a messaging bill to show what House Democrats' priorities are. And so we would expect something much different to come if there is further rounds of coronavirus legislation that actually gets passed into law. It will be a tough lift to get Amtrak funding, I think, in the near term. But that's, again, maybe perhaps another silver lining is I think what CARES, the $1.018 billion passed for Amtrak and CARES, gets us through the end of this fiscal year. And so we can think about fiscal year 2021 as the real battlegrounds. Jim talked about the variables here and how difficult it is to predict the needs. Amtrak has been spending a lot of time and a lot of efforts trying to calculate what that is. Earlier this week, again, as Jim mentioned, they released a supplemental request for funding in FY 2021. 1.475 billion, which totals up to 3.5 billion in funding for FY 2021, which would be the most Amtrak has ever received. So that is, we should all take a moment and kind of pause and think about really the immensity of that number, even though it's relatively small compared to other modes. So that's 737 million for the Northeast corridor, 151 million for the national network. And then I'm going to talk briefly about some other sub carve-outs here. 260 million for state-supported routes, 28 state-supported routes across the U.S., and they account for more than 50% of Amtrak's ridership. Right now, they are covered by a mix of ridership revenue and state-provided funds. I think it's a 70-30 split on average. Jim already mentioned state budgets are being blown out of the water right now from a lack of sales tax revenue, from a loss in payroll revenue, and there's going to be some really hard conversations about what gets cut. And for us to go to state legislatures and say we need more money to run the same amount of trains when you're firing teachers and policemen, that's going to be a very hard sell. And so it's really important that we go to the federal government and say, we need this short-term fix at the state level to make sure these routes don't go away. Amtrak has also identified 229 million for commuter railroads, all of which are located on the Northeast corridor. There's a number of states along the NEC where that access Amtrak's Northeast corridor infrastructure. They provide funding every year, which is a really important source of revenue to ensure the stability of the corridor for both intercity and commuter traffic. And again, these states are seeing huge losses in revenue and ridership bottom out as people work from home. So this is, again, something we're going to really want to hit hard when we talk to our members of Congress and our senators and our representatives when we talk about the needs in 2021. And finally, mass transit, there's a large variance here in the estimates of what we need. Jim again talked about this is a moving target. There's a lot of unknowns, known unknowns. So the American Public Transportation Association has kind of the low boundary with the 23.8 billion. We've seen that go as high as MTA, the Metropolitan Transportation Authority, which estimates 32 billion. I believe both of those. I don't know when I'm going to take a subway again, so I wouldn't pretend to know when ridership will return to normal. But it's important that, as we talk to our elected representatives, that we keep in mind the really important question, which is we can't get distracted by the urban transportation planning debate over, the elasticity of demands for rail transit in big cities. Because if we don't come through with the supplemental funding, the question is going to be answered for us, because we're going to lose a lot of frequencies. We're going to lose a lot of service. And we're going to see a lot of transit agencies go into kind of a death spiral, where they become a lot less useful and people start finding other ways to get around. And it takes years to recover, if they recover at all. We have two strategies that we are going to pursue as we think about the vehicle for advancing additional funding in the upcoming coronavirus packages or appropriations packages. The first is to clearly define the stakes. We need to really be very on message, be very clear in communicating with our elected officials about what is at stake here. Amtrak, in their supplemental request, which was released earlier this week, gave us a lot of ammunition on that front. They said, if we get these supplemental funds on the Northeast Corridor and the Acela, we will see moderate to normal service, state supported. We're going to see some services operate on reduced schedules, but they will be able to come back when demand returns. And on the long distance routes, we again will see reduced service for a temporary amount of time until we are able to see demand return to pre-COVID levels, and then we will bring back these trains. If we do not get the funds, we're going to see greatly reduced service on the Northeast Corridor. Many of the state-supported services will disappear entirely, and the long-distance routes, again, we don't know which routes. Unfortunately, there's a lot of unknowns here. But again, all these services could be at risk of disappearing permanently. I'm going to ask Joe and Maddie to one of you to link to this report that Amtrak released earlier this week. They have an appendix at the very end, which goes service through service and kind of looks at what the potential risks are if we don't address the supplemental funding question. I think it's worth your time, and it's worth going through. And it's a 7-page document. It's not inordinately long, and it's worth really kind of thinking about what's at stake here and why we need to get involved in the fight to return service to normal. I don't think doom and gloom is going to be enough to get us where we want to go. There's a lot of it going around. It's going to be hard to cut through the noise. So we also are focused on defining a positive vision for growth. Amtrak has identified $50 billion in projects that they're fairly far along in their environmental review process and could move very quickly. The Amfleet 1 replacement, which I know we are all interested in, there's a $2 billion request, and we want to move quickly on that and make sure we get the funding. You can see here Superliner and Amfleet 2 replacements, as well as diesel locomotives. These are all advancing. The Acela replacements are advancing, but we really want to make sure that we take advantage of the heightened interest in infrastructure as economic recovery tool to make sure the national network, we're not just spending more money to get us right back where we started, but that we end up with something better. Rail passengers has also kind of crawled through all the state rail plans. Some of them are out of date, some of them are very up to date, but we found $144 billion in potential rail projects that can move relatively quickly. These couldn't be turned around tomorrow. I don't want to give that impression. In fact, that's going to be a challenge as we talk to offices. We need to make sure that they don't get locked in on the idea of shovel ready, because that will end up in us doing a lot of paving projects and throwing a lot of money at highways. What we really need to do is make the case that investment in passenger rail, while it may take a little bit longer to get off the ground, is going to produce more durable job growth, and it's going to produce greater long-term economic value. You can find these at railpassengers.org/COVID. I hope you check them out, and if you see something we missed there, please send it to us. Some more good news is that we are going to have a lot of bites at the apple. It's always Infrastructure Week in DC. Today, President Trump met with Governor Cuomo from New York to talk about using infrastructure to get the economy back on track. I believe they talked about the Gateway project along the Northeast Corridor, which is of great importance to the state of New York. The House Infrastructure Committee continues to work on a draft surface transportation measure. The House T&I has identified a $55 billion plan for passenger rail. It's $11 billion per year over 5 years. Appropriations committees will need to pass something by September 30th, even if it's a continuing resolution. And we're seeing individual members of Congress advance their own unique visions for what that could be. One of them is Representative Moulton's high-speed rail plan, which we'll hear more about in great detail later. We've also seen Senator Markey come out with a $25 billion plan for conventional rail over 5 years. So there's a lot of exciting things happening. We need to make sure we are persistent in getting our message out to members of Congress, and that we are ready when the floodgates open. I will close out with a quick mention to some committee action that happened in the Senate. We saw the Senate Commerce Committee advance the nomination of Joseph Reuters, Rick Dearborn, and Lynn Westmoreland to the Amtrak board. We also saw the White House release the names of Sarah Feinberg and Chris Coos as new nominees. We have good working relationships with Ms. Feinberg and Mayor Coos. And Jim and I had a good conversation with Lynn Westmoreland earlier this week, where we had an open and frank discussion about his views of the national network and his openness to receive information. So there's a lot of change over here. A lot of these nominees represent unknowns and could be risks, because as Jim and I have talked about, there's a lot of important decisions that need to be made over the next 18 months. And we're going to see a lot of turnover at the top of Amtrak's governing structure. So this is something to keep our eye on, and we hope we can count on you in getting our message across to members of Congress, but also Amtrak management. And I think I've reached my time limit here. I know that was a fire hose of information, but I wanted to give everyone the opportunity to submit their questions before we turn it over to Representative Moulton. Joe, I'm going to turn it over to you, and you can kind of give me the questions that have been submitted through the chat box, and Jim and I will see if we can answer them.
All right. Question came up a lot in the chats about the Lackawanna cutoff. So the first question we got was, any advocacy or advice be provided in the forthcoming legislation for the Lackawanna cutoff and the MARC extension into Delaware?
That's a good question. Off the top of my head, I do not have anything prepared. I know this is something that has been a campaign that a lot of our members are interested in pursuing. I know that there was recently legislation released at the state level about that. And so that's something I can follow up with individual members offline and see if I can get that in the all-member update that we send out following this webinar.
One thing I can add to that is that, one of the things that before COVID happened, one of the things that Amtrak asked us for late in the year, just before the holidays, was some thought around things that we might suggest as part of the regional expansion. There are obviously things in the rail plans already, the state rail plans, the FRA rail plans, a lot of those are already baked, but they were wide open to other issues as well. Personally, I'm a big fan of the Lackawanna cutoff as one of those potential advances. I think it's a fantastic idea, and it's one of those things that actually makes a lot of financial sense. So it's worth looking at as part of a larger package. if you look at Amtrak's priorities pre-COVID, they were mostly around the southeast part of the United States, but not entirely. They were also looking at Front Range. They were also looking up in Washington and Oregon, so there's no reason that conversation could not continue. But I think just in general, when we're sitting here today with an Amtrak that's operating at 5% of its regular capacity, and we're asking Congress for 1.4 or $1.5 billion in rescue aid, talking about individual routes is probably not gonna be the place to go. What we're trying right now to stave off draconian, possibly fatal cuts, particularly if you look at the long distance service. If you go to 3 times a week across the system, even temporarily, we're going to have to make sure people understand that when those economics decline on those trains, which they inevitably will, everybody knows 3 times a week is just a non-starter for decent train service. People are going to have to understand that that is an artifact of going to 3 times a week and not an indicator of demand, and therefore a reason not to restore the service. So I suspect that a lot of this is going to be congressionally negotiated and mandated as we go forward looking at rescue dollars.
Yeah, Jim, I'll also add that when talking with Amtrak, Amtrak Government Affairs, they are still talking to state transportation departments about expanding service. It's a state-led process. I think they are excited about the possibility of federal appropriators funding the Amtrak Corridor Development Program, which would be a really important tool in helping them be able to go to client states and say, we can get you through the hard parts if you are willing of launching the service, if you are willing to find a way to fund it sustainably from an operations point of view. I saw news reports about returning Amtrak service to Nashville. So I expect we will continue to hear news reports about and reports from Amtrak itself in the states about those plans as they try to develop them. But Jim, you are right. It is a very tough fiscal environment to do more than plan for the future when things aren't looking so grim from a budgetary standpoint. So at this point, there's going to be a lot of planning. I think Lackawanna is fairly well along the planning phase.
So I see that Representative Moulton has joined us. So I think we should go ahead and turn over to that part of the program. Sean, can you advance the slide, please?
All right. Hello, everybody. How are you?
Congressman Moulton, it's great to see you. It's been a while. I hope you're well.
So I
Sir,
have to apologize. Hold on a second. Let me see.
There we go. Okay.
The irony of trying to sell a next generation transportation technology from a House of Representatives that can't figure out 20th century internet technology. Not lost on me, and perhaps not lost on all of you. Our network is painfully slow, but I think I've figured a workaround to make this work better.
You have. Listen, thank you so much for being here. It's great to see you again.
Glad to be here. Glad to be here with all of you. I feel like I'm in good company, familiar company, and I'm excited to tell you about our proposal.
So if you would, take us through that. I thought it was an incredibly ambitious plan. We were very pleased to see it. I think I'll get into probably a little bit more of it here in a few minutes, but my sense was that a lot of the news coverage sort of focused on that headline number, which is a fantastic number, and it's a great proposal. But there's a lot of other really interesting things going on in your proposal as well, and I hope we have a chance to take us through some of that this afternoon as well. I know your time is limited. But can you just kind of outline it for us?
Yeah, that's absolutely right. So, look, because this is a very up to speed, pardon the pun, group as far as high-speed rail goes, I'm not going to give you just sort of the general overview that I would give to any typical audience. Instead, let me concentrate on what differentiates this plan from some of the other proposals that have been out there or have been, worked on over the years, including the Obama proposal that looked great coming out of the gate and then didn't get too far. So, Jim, you've really put this well. Yes, there's a lot of money that we would like to put behind this, but usually people talk about high-speed rail just in terms of money, and then it just comes down to what is, able to get through the House and the Senate and then across the president's desk, which often is not very much. But what I realized is that it's not just a question of getting money out there. It's a question of actually having a funding framework as already exists for other transportation modes, and having the regulatory environment to not just provide a little bit of cash and a grant here or a grant there, but really incentivize states and the federal government to invest in high-speed rail as a reasonable alternative to other modes when solving transportation problems. I've always believed that if you just simply let high-speed rail compete on a level playing field against aviation and against highways, it would do really well. And this is why you see high-speed rail being built everywhere else in the world. I mean, look, Saudi Arabia is not building high-speed rail because they love electric powertrains over oil powertrains, right? They're like the oil capital of the world, and yet they build high-speed rail because it's just an efficient use of transportation dollars. They get a better ROI from building high-speed rail, even though they're not going to use as much of their free oil. Same thing in places like Morocco and Russia, and of course all over Europe and Japan. But here in the United States, we've never really considered high-speed rail as an option. It's just not, we don't have the framework in law to enable states to really choose that. They're heavily incentivized to choose alternatives. So that's the big thing that we wanted to do. Now, let me just say to a group of rail advocates here that you can make a very compelling argument that we shouldn't have a level playing field at all, that what we should have is a playing field that's highly skewed towards rail because it's better for the environment. It's better for public safety. It's better for economic development. It promotes the kind of smart growth, sustainable growth that we all want. There's a great argument that we should heavily subsidize high-speed rail at the expense of aviation and highways. But I'm not even going that far with this proposal. I'm just saying let high-speed rail compete on a level playing field. And I think if we can achieve that, which is an argument that's a little bit hard to disagree with, for the critics of high-speed rail, who tend to be, not exclusively, but tend to be more conservative, tend to be Republicans, it's hard for them to argue, oh no, we don't want to let the free market make the wisest investment here. So that's the case that we're trying to make. And in order to do that, yes, we have asked for some initial funding, but I think more importantly, we've started to make some of the regulatory changes to set up the framework to allow this kind of investment. Right now, there really are no high-speed rail regulations in the United States, and that's pretty pathetic. In fact, under the Obama administration, they changed the definition of high-speed rail to lower it. I mean, talk about the opposite of ambitious. They actually lowered it. So to try to make things that only go 125 miles an hour, which is like a 100-year-old technology, count as high-speed rail, whereas that wouldn't come close in other parts of the world. So we are trying to raise the bar, standardize the bar, and provide a method for states to choose this as a real alternative. Now, with regards to higher speed rail, which I know is a concern of many people on the call, we have also put in incentives for those kinds of investments, but they're really geared towards, with an eye towards true high-speed rail, because I think that's the piece that's really been missing in the United States. We don't have a single high-speed rail operation for Americans to ride on. The Acela really doesn't count, and I'm happy to have that argument with you. But anyone who's ridden the TGV or the Shinkansen knows the Acela does not count.
And you know I wouldn't argue with you.
and if we get to the point where either California or Texas actually provides that option for Americans, and people can see, wow, this is just a world of difference compared to getting in my car or fighting through security lines at an airport, I think the story will start to be very different. But there are a lot of places in the United States where we could be running trains much faster than we do right now, even if they're not, necessarily future high-speed rail corridors, by simply incentivizing states to make necessary improvements. I'll give you an example. I took the train this summer up to Maine. It's a trip I've done many times, but I was very carefully following my journey on a map, and I noticed that there are actually quite a few straightaways in this very old right-of-way between Boston and Portland, Maine. But the problem is, of course, that you go for a few miles on a straightaway and then you come to a very sharp turn. Now, in our highway system, we have incentives for states to invest to make those curves faster, to take out stoplights, for example, or do overpasses. But that doesn't really exist for rail investment. So we want to provide a framework for, say, the state of Massachusetts to get together with New Hampshire and Maine and say, you know what, we could reduce travel time a lot for not too much expense by just changing some of these, lengthening some of these curves, and also potentially electrifying. So these are some of the things that we've put in to incentivize higher speed rail, but really with an eye towards eventually getting towards a true high-speed rail service. Boston to Portland is an interesting comparison because right now it's let's say a 3-hour trip or whatnot. Portland happens to have amazing restaurants, and my wife and I would love to go there for dinner. But we're not going to take a 3-hour trip to go up for dinner and then come back, even if the schedule allowed it. With true high-speed rail speeds, you could get from Boston to Portland in 30 or 40 minutes. Now that would be truly transformative because we would literally go up there for dinner and come back. And that's the big difference between, say, okay, we'll shave off 15 minutes here and shave off 20 minutes there. It doesn't, statistically, that doesn't change travel habits that much until you get a real transformative difference in travel time. So why don't I leave it at that and then open to questions? And I hope this format works because I figure that we've got a real, advanced crew here. So you'd rather kind of dive into the details rather than have me give any more of just a general overview.
No, I appreciate that. And no, I think so far so good. Let's see how we do. It's interesting you bring up that example about going to Portland to go to dinner. One of the things that I really fastened onto in the proposal is a better appreciation of the externalities. And we've been doing a lot of work here on the association, as you know, about that. And that's a perfect example. You and your wife go to dinner in Portland because you can. Now that times however many riders, all of a sudden you change the fabric of the economy of Portland. Mm-hmm. And you see this effect even with conventional speed rail all over the country, where there's an economic benefit associated with the people going in and out of the service. So can you maybe talk a little bit more about one of my mantras has always been, it's not a question of whether passenger trains make money, it's who they make money for. And I was really excited to see how you wanted to incorporate externalities in the analysis and the benefit cost analysis and so forth. I think that would really help. And could you maybe take us through a little bit why that was important to you to change the way the government approaches rail as part of sort of the larger transportation framework?
Yeah, absolutely. I was standing, this is kind of a story I don't tell that much, but I had a summer job on a track crew up in North Common, New Hampshire, and I was standing out on the green one summer, and this political figure came up, and there's people gathering around. I didn't even know it was, I just saw this group of people listening to a guy talking, and I was not into politics at all then. I hadn't studied it in school, didn't know that I was going to run for Congress by any stretch of my imagination. But I went up to this guy who turned out to be a young governor from Texas running for president. And people were asking a bunch of questions of him about different things, and they were all sort of very, softball questions. So I decided to throw out a question about Amtrak, and I said, why are you proposing to cut Amtrak? And the long and short of it is, he said, because Amtrak loses money, it's not profitable. And I said, well, I mean, the interstate highways don't make money, and we heavily subsidize them. And he said, oh, no, but they provide a lot of economic benefit. Okay, so in other words, what Governor at the time Bush was saying is that we count the positive externalities for highways, but we don't count them for Amtrak. And any transportation policy expert would tell you that to really make wise transportation decisions, you have to look at the externalities, because the externalities for transportation are huge. So in other words, not just the direct benefit, the direct costs of transportation, but all the other things that it influences, like where people work, what kinds of businesses develop, how vibrant the economy is. All these sorts of things, environmental costs, land use costs, these are things that are heavily influenced by transportation decisions, and so they should be factored in. So what does this mean in practical terms? Well, it means that if we're looking at the cost of building a highway, we shouldn't just look at what it costs to construct it. We should also look at the cost in terms of land use. Highways take a lot of space. We should look at the cost in terms of pollution, because highways create a lot of pollution, which actually literally costs lives when you look at this statistically, and that should be accounted for. Highways cause deaths because there are a lot of deaths on highways. Highways have a lot of costs that are not considered direct costs to operate the highway, in terms of like plowing the roads or repairing potholes. But they absolutely are costs to operate the highway, because you have state police that have to patrol the highway. You have ambulances that have to serve for all the crashes. And yet these things are never counted in the calculation for building highways. And they should be. And you know what? If at the end of the day we say, okay, this highway is going to cost $2 billion to build, and then it's going to cost, $10 million a year to staff with emergency vehicles, and it's going to cost $20 million a year in terms of the cost of the deaths that result by using this highway. And we add this all up and we say, you know what, the real cost is more like $3 or $4 billion, but we still think it's worth it. It's better than the alternatives. We should still build the highway. Then fine. But the point is, let's get the full cost here. I'm an Iraq War veteran. It's like saying that the Iraq War only costs what it takes to buy the bullets and send the men over, and you're not caring for all of us when we get home, because we all come home with post-traumatic stress and other things, and we have a huge cost for the VA system. Those are real costs attributable to the Iraq War. They should be counted when we consider what the Iraq War actually costs. So the thing about high-speed rail is that when you go down all these things, environmental issues, land use issues, the type of businesses that you attract to high-speed rail served downtowns, you find out that the externalities are almost all favorable to high-speed rail. It's better for pollution, it's better for land use, it's better for safety compared to the alternatives. And so, look, from a transportation policy perspective, counting externalities is just the right thing to do. From a high-speed rail advocacy perspective, it's also a way that high-speed rail will, you'll really see the benefits when it comes to making these decisions. Does that answer your question, Jim?
It does. It does. Thank you. And I know you're short on time. Do you have time for one more, or do you need?
Oh yeah,
to
no. I can take it. So we have votes that are supposed to be happening right now, but they've been delayed.
Okay.
So I can go for a little bit longer. Let me just because I'm on a roll here, let me just bring up one other interesting example of how these transportation policy decisions are often, very poorly made. So in addition to high-speed rail, I'm a big advocate for regional rail service, converting commuter rail systems that just go in at rush hour and out at rush hour into true regional rail systems that provide transportation at all hours of the day, not just into a city center, but around an area. So Massachusetts has a commuter rail system. It's a 1950s diesel push-pull system that really hasn't changed at all since then. That's actually not true. The service is worse than it was 70 years ago. But really it has the infrastructure to potentially support much more effective service. Now I live on the map here. I live up sort of by Peabody there, a little south of Gloucester. And if you look, just pick some place on the South Shore like Weymouth or Duxbury. You can ask this question of just about anybody who lives north of Boston. You know, how many times have you been to the South Shore? And the answer is like hardly ever, because it takes 2 hours to drive through Boston. I mean, I've been to California more often than I've been to Weymouth. All right, but if we had a regional rail system that was connected by the North-South Rail Link, so that you could take a train in literally 30 minutes from Peabody to Weymouth, or more specifically Salem to Weymouth, that would be a totally different story. But when the state of Massachusetts, the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, did a study on the North-South Rail Link, you know, one of the things we pointed out is that it's going to enable all the people who live north of Boston to work south of Boston. So it's going to literally double or triple the job market for everybody, because they will have access to a whole bunch of other jobs that they can't reasonably commute to by car. When they did the study, they said, well, we counted up the numbers, and it turned out that only like 7 people from Salem will take the North-South Rail Link through Boston, through the city, to get a job on the South Shore. Well, the reason they came up with 7 people is because that's the total number of people who are doing that today, right? They're not accounting for the fact that when the travel time from Boston to the South Shore suddenly drops from 2.5 hours at rush hour to 30 minutes, a lot of people are going to take it, right? So the answer, it's sort of like, it's if you did go back to the Portland example and said, well, Seth, you're saying that people are going to take high-speed rail from Salem to Portland for dinner. Well, last night we only found 1 person who drove from Salem to Portland for dinner. Okay, yes, right, because that's under current conditions. But you have to look at how this totally changes the picture, and that's one of the failures with a lot of these transportation studies in the past, because they're just looking at existing options, and we all know how long it takes to drive from one place to another. High-speed rail is totally transformative because it cuts travel times so dramatically.
And I think too, I think one of the things that's underappreciated is the degree to which high-speed rail is not an either-or proposition, right? I mean, we're not saying that if you do this, you can't do that. You know, one of the things that I've seen, at least, is that investments in high-speed rail really can actually benefit conventional rail systems as well, through electrifying the corridors. It creates incentives for transit-oriented development, and all of the development that takes place around the station areas, that injects private capital into local economies and supports the tax base and all of those kinds of benefits as well. So
that's right.
I think that's an important thing, and it's overlooked.
It's totally overlooked. And I can tell you that we have talked to some of the freight railroads with this proposal, and they're fine with it. What I think that they probably don't realize is that if the American public just got much more used to actually recognizing that sometimes investing in rail is worth taxpayer dollars, you know, eventually the freight railroads might really stand to benefit. I mean, let me ask you this: how much is freight traffic down due to COVID-19, due to the pandemic? I don't know if anyone knows, but
it's down almost as much as Amtrak. We had a meeting with the One Rail Coalition recently, and those folks were reporting that they were down, 80, 90%.
Right. So right now, Congress has already given a whole bunch of essentially free money to the airlines to bail them out, but no one's even talking about giving money to the freight railroads. That's just totally inequitable. Why should we subsidize one transportation mode over another? And so the point is that, I think the railroad industry for a long time, specifically the freight railroads, have been very afraid of federal government involvement because of the history and everything. But if there was actually some wise investment in rail and more recognition more broadly in America that investing in rail makes sense, then I think you would not just see a benefit in passenger rail, but you'd see more money flowing to freight railroads as well. Because in many cases, when you have a transportation problem, it's not just a passenger transportation challenge, it's a freight transportation challenge. And again, there are a lot of places where investing money in, double tracking a freight line or speeding up a freight line, maybe even electrifying it, would get a much better ROI than adding a bunch of lanes to highways. I think
that's a really important point, that, you're really working to bring the freight railroads in, bring them to the table here as willing partners. I mean, we said in our surface transportation reauthorization blueprint, our FAST Act blueprint, that we think that if you could have increased payments per mile or tax credits for transfer of rights of way and those kinds of things, bring them in as partners. And as you said, help them understand that there's actually a longer term benefit here to them if we could encourage, making existing rights of way available in some fashion.
That's right. And again, it's not just an either or thing. I mean, look at Texas Central. They were initially planning to largely use a BNSF right of way. My understanding is that they've now shifted to use largely a power line right of way. But the point is that they just looked at these alternatives and they decided, okay, this one actually makes more sense from an economic perspective. They costed them out. So to say that building high-speed rail necessitates using freight railway right-of-ways is not true at all. There are a lot of places where building it alongside an interstate would make more sense. But you want to have the freights at the table so that they can at least participate in this discussion. And sometimes there might be a mutual benefit where they have a bunch of a good bit of land along a corridor that's not used, and they love the tax incentive to have that used for high-speed rail, as long as it's a fair deal for them.
So that actually brings up an interesting point. I mean, everyone, of course, knows your history with Texas Central. And I think you may have a uniquely valuable perspective here on incentivizing private investment. How does the plan that you're outlining tackle that question of incentivizing private investment?
Right. Well, this is really important because there is tremendous interest in putting private money into high-speed rail, which is actually pretty extraordinary because you don't see Microsoft saying, "Hey, we'd really love to invest in adding a lane to the interstate." But Microsoft has actually funded themselves a study on high-speed rail in the Pacific Northwest corridor. The study, as I'm sure you all know, was very favorable. Incidentally, and just simply comparing the costs of building high-speed rail compared to adding a lane to the interstate, high-speed rail came in way cheaper. And again, it's also many times faster. So it's not, it's cheaper to build, to build a railway that goes 65 miles an hour. It actually turns out it's cheaper to build a railway that goes 250 miles an hour compared to adding a lane that goes 65. So again, way more benefit. So what we want to do is provide a framework for potentially taking private investment in, but especially for incentivizing states, because a lot of transportation decisions really start at the state level. And the brilliance of the interstate highway system, the proposal, the legislation, is that it really incentivizes states to say, okay, we're going to invest in this road. We're going to pay a little bit of extra money to bring it up to interstate standards. And that's going to trigger a whole bunch of federal investment that make it worthwhile. And that's the same kind of thing that we're looking for here. We want states to be incentivized to choose, to look at this as a serious alternative, to choose high-speed rail, and then get federal support if they bring it up to those standards. And they don't, we should not be building any more 1950s diesel push-pull commuter rail systems in the United States, except in really narrow circumstances. I mean, it just doesn't make economic sense when you really do the full analysis. The problem is that it's sometimes just the slightly cheaper alternative, even though it's the worst long-term investment. And so that's why a lot of states are going that route when they really should be building all electric systems up front. I was actually involved very peripherally in the discussions around building the brand new Denver commuter rail system, including the line to the airport, while I was working at a bank in business school. And the state was basically like, let's do diesels because it's cheaper. And the bank, which actually had to fund this whole thing and finance it over the course of 30 years, did the detailed financial analysis, which came back and said, no. The upfront cost of electrifying is more, but the life cycle costs are lower. It makes more sense. And oh, by the way, delivers better service and is better for the environment. So it was actually the Wall Street Bank that pushed that consortium to build an all electrified system from scratch, rather than going with the slightly lower initial capital costs of a diesel system. So that's an example of where we're trying to really incentivize folks to make states to make the right long-term, the best long-term investment decisions.
And I imagine, I mean, certainly as we're all sort of wrestling with the coronavirus crisis, I think the temptation is even stronger to focus on short-term thinking. I mean, it's a natural human tendency. And yet this might be precisely the right moment to, secure not just initial investment in sort of getting America back to work and getting the transportation infrastructure going, but in really making that solid long-term bet, because it does make new kinds of jobs possible. It does make new kinds of travel possible. It means you can go to dinner in these places, or maybe even live in one place and work in another. And all of that creates an economic benefit as you spend money in new places and you buy houses in new places and so forth. And I think we have an extra challenge right now because we're so focused on just getting through the next 30 days.
Right.
What's your advice to all of us as fellow advocates here on how to maybe overcome that and maybe working with your colleagues to get folks thinking on the long-term benefit as well as the short-term?
Well, first of all, you've got to show that you recognize the immediate need here. And look, I've been a tremendous advocate for, I was one of the first people to write the vice president and say we need more testing for COVID-19. I did that, when people were literally making fun of me for saying this is going to be a big deal. I'm someone who advocated for the rights of grocery store workers and making sure they get proper personal protective equipment. So, I mean, we got to make sure we deal with the immediate crisis. But it would be a huge mistake as we think about coming out of this and rebuilding from this to invest to make poor long-term investments rather than investing in the future. And that should be something that people can understand. An interesting historical comparison is looking at Europe after World War II. I mean, Europe was devastated by World War II, far worse, far, far worse than what we're seeing with the coronavirus. Far more people killed. Just cities literally leveled to the ground. Imagine if people had come out of that and said, you know what we need to do? We just need to rebuild Europe exactly as it was. Rebuild all the old roads and cow paths. And if that was a dirt road, we'll make it a dirt road again because that's the cheapest and quickest thing to do. We know what that road looked like. We'll just make it a dirt road. That's not what they did. They made longer term investments. And one of the reasons why Europe has a good rail system is because they invested in really building railroads to modern standards coming out of World War II, rather than just recreating the old railroads that we had before. So, it would be sort of like if we came out of this crisis and we looked at, the fact, okay, we need more internet service. And there are some places that the copper phone lines are tapped out and they can't push any more data through them. And so we just built more copper phone lines rather than saying, wait, hold your horses. We should be building fiber optics. Like that's the modern technology here. The rest of the world recognizes that high-speed rail is modern technology. Just adding lanes to superhighways is what we did in the 1950s. So we've got to say to people, let's make the right long-term investments for the future, because this is a generational opportunity. If we have a big infrastructure bill, and if it's as big as people are talking about, this will truly be a generational opportunity to invest in infrastructure. And it would be a generational mistake to invest in the last generation's infrastructure.
So how much appetite are you seeing among your colleagues for this? I mean, it depends for us. Every time we meet with staff and members and so forth, it almost feels as if it varies from week to week on whether there's appetite for a major infrastructure investment or not. What's your sense right now?
Let me answer that question in two ways. One, just what the appetite is for major infrastructure investment writ large, and then two, what the appetite is for this particular proposal. In terms of just writ large, like, do we actually expect an infrastructure bill? I'm not terribly optimistic. I'll be honest with you. This is the third or fourth time President Trump has said that he wants major infrastructure investments. It's never come through. The Senate doesn't seem to have any interest in it under Mitch McConnell, and the president doesn't want to pay for anything. So it doesn't seem terribly realistic that this is actually going to happen. But the reason why we push this out right now is because we don't want to miss the boat if by some wonderful chance it does happen. We want to make sure that this proposal is part of the mix. So I'll tell you, thinking strategically about this, and I've been thinking about high-speed rail legislation ever since I actually got elected to Congress, my plan was to write this legislation and then spend a long time socializing it with my colleagues behind the scenes before releasing it publicly to try to get more buy-in. We were not able to do that because of the urgency of getting this simply on the table for discussion if in fact we do a major infrastructure bill. So that was a political decision that we made. More important to have it out there, even though we have not yet had a chance to sit down with a lot of colleagues and discuss it. So the second part of the answer here is that if you ask people about this proposal, they probably haven't even seen it yet. And so you can be a huge help to me as advocates in simply educating my colleagues, both on the Democratic and the Republican side, about why this is valuable, why this is such an improvement over the Obama proposal, why that didn't work, and what we've changed to make this successful. Incidentally, I had a wonderful discussion with Secretary Ray LaHood on the phone a few days before releasing this, went through it with him. He said, this is exactly what we need. That's a quote. And he specifically cited a lot of the things that, have made improvements over what they did in the Obama administration, much of it around, setting up this whole regulatory framework, which they weren't able to get done. So the goal for us is to just get more people talking about this right now and understanding it. And by the way, also giving us feedback, because there's no reason why we can't make amendments and changes to this. This is not anything we're going to be voting on anytime soon. It's something that we would like to see included in a larger transportation bill if it happens. But it's still very much open for discussion, amendments, and changes.
Well, I think I can assure you that you have not only the association, but a lot of our members would be more than willing to pick up a phone or shoot an email and help with that project. I think it's terrific, and I think we all do.
Yeah, and just when you do that, point out this isn't just about the top line number. I wouldn't even talk about the top line number, because frankly, the heart of this legislation isn't the however many $1 billion we get for it. It's setting up this base, this foundation for high-speed rail investment in the future. So what people should talk about, and we can actually provide you some talking points that we think will be effective with fellow Democrats, and then as I'm a Democrat, I say that, but also my colleagues across the aisle, many of whom are friends, but many of whom are more skeptical of high-speed rail. We can share with you some talking points on how this is different, on how it's better, and how it's fundamentally aligned with our American values, which say that we believe in a free market economy. We believe in free market competition, and we ought to make business-based transportation decisions based, with a true free market here, where each mode can compete fairly against the other, and ultimately taxpayers get the best return on investment for their tax dollars.
I think that's a great way to end it. I love to talk about how the money that we spend on rail transportation produces a return on equity for the taxpayer in the form of a boosted economy and so forth. So I think it's a completely compatible idea. And again, we're just thrilled that you were able to stop by and visit with us this afternoon and share details of the proposal, because we do think it's transformative. We couldn't agree more. We've included some of these ideas in our blueprint already, and we will probably include more. But listen, I very much appreciate your leadership on all of these issues. You've been a staunch leader on rail really since the beginning, and I also appreciate your continued relationship with us here at the association. Thanks so much for being here.
Jim, thank you for having me. And look, we're grateful for your support. We're grateful for your advocacy. We're also grateful for your feedback. There are a lot of smart minds on here this afternoon. And if you have suggestions, ways we can improve the proposal, we'd love to hear those as well. So keep in touch, and we will too. Take care.
All right. Take care now. Be well.
Okay, I'm going to jump in here. Thank you, Jim. Thank you to Congressman Moulton and his staffers. That was, they spent a lot of time with us. A lot of time. Thank you to everyone who stuck around. We're 23 minutes over when we said we'd let you go. I am conscious of the fact that we did not answer as many questions as I wanted to. There was a lot of information to get through when you have a congressman on the line and he's willing to talk to you about that kind of exciting plan. You stick with it. Please, if you have questions, email them to narp@narprail.org. We're going to send out a follow-up email with this presentation, a link to the video, and if we can answer those questions, if we can, we will try to get through a Q&A at the bottom of the email, and hopefully we can, if your question is useful to anyone else who was on this call, we can get to that. Maddie, I don't know if you're still on here, but if you want to close us out,
I'm here.
please
Hi.
do.
Great. Yeah, thank you so much to everyone who participated today. If you don't mind, next slide. So please stay in touch during the digital conversation. You can find us at Rail Passengers. Follow along in the hotline for additional information on our upcoming webinars. Again, if anyone is interested in donating, supporting our future efforts, please reach out to me directly for additional webinar topics. I am M. Butler at NARPRail. Glad to help out. Glad to be here today. And thanks to everyone who attended.
And next month, late June, we will touch on the Front Range Passenger Rail Corridor as the next on our rolling series of webinars that are going to take place at in-person meeting. So hope you join us then. And if you have any ideas for future webinar topics, please send them. We're always interested in kind of being responsive to you, our members. Thank you again, and have an excellent day.
Thank you, everybody, for joining us. Everyone stay well.